Welcome to the Divorce Podcast, a podcast that aims to address divorce, separation and co-parenting here in the UK, countering the often sensationalist way it's portrayed in the media, challenging the status quo and driving for reform. On each episode, I'm joined by experts to discuss divorce, separation and co-parenting from different angles and to give their opinions and to debate them. I'm Kate Daly, a relationship counsellor and divorce coach, co-founder of Amicable, the divorce services company, and host of this, the Divorce Podcast. In this episode, I was joined by Clive Coleman to discuss the introduction of no-fault divorce, the media narrative around it, and future reform in the divorce space. As the BBC's legal correspondent between 2010 and 2020, Clive was the face and voice of legal coverage and analysis across the BBC, radio, television, and the website. His background in law as a practicing barrister has fed into his journalism. Prior to his work with the BBC, he was a presenter for a number of years, and Clive is also an acclaimed writer for theatre, television, and film. Most recently, The Duke, based on a real-life legal drama. He's also been through his own divorce, which we talk about in this episode. We look specifically at how the media have previously covered divorce, its responsibility in sparking change, as well as future reform. Clive responds to the criticism around no-fault divorce from religious groups, and we both agreed that Amicable is well placed in offering information and guidance around the new laws and no-fault divorce. If you really loved this episode or want to hear more episodes like this, then please make sure to rate us on your preferred listening platform. Enjoy the episode. Welcome, Clive.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Oh, it's lovely to see you, and thank you very much for taking the time to come and speak to us on the podcast. Now, I mentioned in my intro that you've had an illustrious career as a journalist, now turned film writer, but you started out as a barrister. Can you just tell us a little bit about your background, Clive, and how you came to be the BBC's legal correspondent?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I've had a ridiculously varied career, none of which I in any way planned. So I did an English degree at York University a long, long time ago, and didn't really know where that was going to get me in terms of any sort of gainful employment. So I decided I'd become a barrister, or try and become a barrister. I think largely because my dad had always loved the courts and been fascinated by, the law, and I think had wanted to become a barrister. Actually, back in those days, he came from a very humble background, and it cost money to become a barrister, and he didn't have the money, and he never sat me down and said, "I really want you to become a barrister." But I think that influence, and we went to courts together, and he actually became a patent lawyer, and was, in fact, in his heydays, he was instructing some of the best and the most brilliant at the patent bar. I also quite like the idea of a job where you could just get up and talk all the time, because that's the only thing I felt I had any talent for whatsoever. So so I did that, and I did a law conversion course and was called to the bar in 1986.
And did you specialise in a particular area of law then?
No, I did a lot of things really badly. I was in a general common law set of chambers. I did anything that came through the door. I did, some low-level criminal work, prosecutor for the CPS a bit, and defence work. And the chambers was mainly sort of personal injury and medical negligence chambers. So I did a bit of that. But I was only in practice for about 4 years, and I decided to leave because I actually wanted to become a comedy writer. And the only way I could work out, I started writing some sketches, and I sent one into Spitting Image, and they put it on, and I thought, oh well, I'd really like to have a go at this. And I remember going and talking to the clerk in my chambers and saying, I really would like to be a comedy writer. I think I'm going to try and run the two careers together. What do you think? He said, I don't think you could or you should, and I think you should leave. Or words to that effect. Worse to that effect.
There's quite a link, isn't there, if you think about it? I suppose as a barrister, you're up on your feet and you're acting to some extent apart in a courtroom theatre, aren't you? And then to make that leap to sort of television and presenting information and the aspect of language and everything else. I guess the link is there, isn't it, if you look for it?
Definitely. And, in fact, people sometimes say, what's more terrifying, being, a barrister standing up, let's say, in the Court of Appeal and getting your arguments dismantled limb by limb by 3 brilliant judges, or being a live broadcaster? And the answer is being a live broadcaster, because if you get it wrong in the Court of Appeal, 30 people get to hear about it. But if you get it wrong on the 10 o'clock news, it's more like 5 million. So that is more nerve-wracking. Yeah. But a lot of barristers, they have that sort of performing gene, clearly. And a lot of them are sort of actors manqué, I think, somewhat. So the two things are connected. And quite a few people have tunneled out from the bar into performing in one way or another.
So you made this leap. So you sacked yourself from Chambers and went to be a comedy sketch writer. How did you get?
Well, I sort of did it
back to the BBC.
Yeah, no, what happened was that I decided I couldn't sort of just leave, because I wasn't making any real money. I was getting the odd sketch on television and radio, but I wasn't really making any money. So I I taught at the Inns of Court School of Law. I taught barristers, and I did that for a long time, actually, for getting on for 10 years. And it was great because it was a teaching year. So it gave me lots and lots of time to write comedy. And also I had a ready-made audience of students. My lectures were without doubt the worst lectures in the entire institution, but they were quite well attended just because I was trying out a lot of material.
It was entertaining. Yeah, the most entertaining.
It was quite entertaining, I think. So I did that. And it's funny, actually, because when I then became a journalist, I was sort of sitting in court covering cases thinking, God, I taught the junior barrister. And I taught the QC, and then now several of the students that I'm ashamed to say, well, not ashamed to say, but it's a mark of my age that several of the students that I taught are now High Court judges. So, wow. Some of them managed to get over whatever misinformation I'd imparted over those years, and actually have really good careers in the law, which I'm pleased that they did.
That was brilliant. So you went from teaching, and then from teaching barristers to back to the BBC, or how did that?
Yeah, I mean, so when I was teaching, I was also writing, and I wrote a sitcom about barristers for Radio 4, and then it was on BBC One called Chambers, starring John Bird and Sarah Lancashire. And I was writing, but Chambers had 2 series on television, then it didn't get recommissioned for a 3rd series, and it was a bit like sort of slightly falling off a cliff, in that it was great whilst I was doing it. And then, you have to start again from nothing. And at that point, I was teaching, and I taught a fantastic woman called Ines Bowen, who worked for the BBC. And she phoned me up in 2004 because they were, she qualified as a barrister, but then gone to work for the BBC. They were looking for a new presenter for Law in Action on Radio 4. Right. And I managed by hook or crook to get that job. And I did that for 6 years, between 2004 and 2010. And then sort of managed to parlay that into becoming the BBC Legal Correspondent. So it was really through having left the bar to write comedy that I sort of came into contact with someone who was able to give me an introduction to the BBC.
Wow. And so when you were the BBC's law correspondent, that must have taken you into some very interesting and diverse areas of the law.
Yeah, I mean, it was the most fantastic job. I mean, my brief was that wide. It was the law. I mean, I worked within the Home Affairs unit, and the Home Affairs correspondents were, covered the police, prisons, terrorism. There were some things I didn't cover, that the area involved the law that they covered, but I covered pretty much the whole of the civil law, and obviously large aspects of the criminal law. So it was a massive brief, and yeah, it was just a fantastic job. I mean, I think people are very interested in the law, but they find it complicated. They find it opaque, difficult. And my job was...
Well, I was going to say dull and dry, and you must have brought a bit of sparkle to it then.
Well, I think that the thing that I tried to do was just to make it clear and understandable. And the best feedback I got was if people said, yeah, it was really clear, really got that, because it is critical, the law. It affects everyone's lives, and people want to know it and understand it, but they needed parts of it explained, because it's just not that easy to grasp. So that was always my goal. Like a good jury advocate, you were always looking for a way to unlock an issue that affected people's lives with a good image or a good phrase. And that was that's part of the skill. I mean, you listen to some of the fantastic kind of my colleagues at the BBC who are just brilliant. I mean, they have that facility to find those phrases and those images, and to and also you're telling a story often in no time at all. I mean, I used to do a lot of pieces for the Radio 4 1800 bulletin, which I love, is my favorite bulletin in broadcasting. And they were kind of essays in a minute. They were proper essays with a beginning, a middle, and an end, but you only had a minute to write them and tell them. And so you become very adept at using language with enormous economy and just brushing out spare words and phrases and just writing very clearly. It's a great discipline from that point of view, actually.
You mentioned just as you were speaking then that, the law is often very opaque and difficult for normal people to navigate. And that's certainly something, we've talked a lot about on the podcast. You've been divorced yourself. What's been your experience of navigating a legal issue when it's a personal one, as an individual, as somebody who's, facing stuff for the first time?
I think I've yet to meet a couple who have said, well, our divorce was the most wonderful thing that ever happened to us. It was the most positive experience in our lives. It is just a very, very difficult time, particularly when there are children involved, and as there were with us. So it was difficult. It was challenging. I mean, I had a lawyer actually, but I said to my lawyer, look, I can do most of this myself, and I did 90% of the work.
Well, that's interesting. Just why did you have a lawyer then? Because like you say, you could do it yourself. What made you go and get a lawyer?
I think just to have a little bit of distance and a little bit of space and perspective. It was. We tried mediating for various reasons that didn't work for us, and in the end we both had lawyers, and I have to say we managed to go through the whole thing really, I think, with the minimum in terms of, because some divorced couples or divorcing couples literally can't be in the same room, and it's really, really difficult, and I know why that can be. But we tried very hard, and I think we managed quite well through that process to continue talking, particularly in relation to the boys. And, nobody slagged anyone off. And, we've managed to maintain really very good relations post-divorce, which I'm really proud of, actually. And
you should be proud of it.
Because it's tough when, you're kind of being sort of ripped apart, emotionally, financially, you're having to rehouse, you're having to rethink your entire life. You want to be as good a parent as you possibly can be, but you can't be a parent in quite the same way because you're not going to be physically there, all that sort of stuff. It's really, really difficult. And, as a journalist, I was constantly being parachuted into legal situations where people were dealing with very, very difficult problems. But it is, as your questions indicates, when it's you, it's a completely different kettle of fish. And
So do you think you had any advantage given your background then? I mean advantage as in you could navigate it better for yourself rather than advantage over anybody, but did it help or did it hinder?
It probably helped, I think, because I wasn't sort of feeling my way in the dark. I knew the law of divorce, and I knew sort of the process. Having said that, the process at times is so difficult. And, I remember the dreaded Form E, which is this form that we all have to fill out, that, where you have to note down every bit of money or, investment or property, whatever that you've got. And, we didn't have a vast amount, but it was in so many different places. And, I think this Form E was, I honestly think it was sort of the love child of an accountant and a psychopath. I mean, it took me about a week to fill it in, and it reduced me to tears. And if there is an area for divorce law reform, I think, providing something that is a bit more user-friendly and easier to negotiate and navigate than that would certainly be a good start, because, your main focus is on your family and your children and, your relationship going forward. And, and suddenly you're having to deal with, this kind of labyrinthine, and everyone said, oh, that Form E's a total nightmare. And they were all right.
Yes, it's really difficult, and that's definitely one of the things that at Amicable we've tried to do. We've got a much nicer way of collecting your financial information that hopefully doesn't spark, too much antagonism between people. We've worked really hard in trying to find simple ways for collecting that data in? Because when you've got everything else working against you as well, when you're emotionally drained, and as you say, you've got a to-do list as long as your arm in terms of rehousing and resorting everything out, none of that waits, does it? It's all happening to you at the same time.
Exactly. And you're trying to find, building society paying in books from 15 years ago.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Or those dreaded child trust fund accounts that the Labour government brought in. And then I've just,
exactly.
trying to find those is a killer for me.
Checking whether that piggy bank in the back of the cupboard still there. It's that sort of thing doesn't help the process. But we managed to get through it in the end. And I certainly think that when I was able to rehouse, because I actually went back and lived with my parents for a period.
Not uncommon, is it?
No, not uncommon. And I was lucky; they were great parents, and it was nice, actually, very nice to spend time with them. But I don't think they quite thought that this age 50 was going to be coming back and staying with them for quite a long time. I always joked with them that when I went back, and I was very sensitive, and got them both together in the kitchen and said to them, look, for as long as I'm here, really genuinely, I want you to treat the place as if it's your own.
Don't mind me.
It was their own. But there were positive aspects to that. But you don't really want to at that point in your life, particularly go back and live with your parents.
No. You said just a minute ago that you had felt that because you knew how the legal system worked and you understood the divorce laws, that had made things slightly more simple for you. Does that mean realistically that we should be doing more to get some of that basic information out there to people, so that if something awful and a divorce happens, that there is better public information for people? Because it strikes me that if you can start a divorce off in the right way with some decent neutral information, then you've got a much better chance of navigating successfully, rather than, coming at it from a position of no knowledge and not really understanding the parameters or how it all works.
Yeah, no, I think there are absolutely. I mean, I think now, in the kind of online world, people have relatively easy access to some pretty good resources in terms of, introductory guides to divorce and walking people through the process. But I think there is an argument for a number of areas of law, to maybe covered in citizenship classes or whatever at schools, because it is really important. I think, there'll be arguments against, putting divorce into the school curriculum. Some people wouldn't think that was very appropriate. But I think I've always thought that, people say a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. I think that's nonsense. I think a little knowledge is a good thing, and a bit more knowledge is a better thing, and a lot of knowledge is a really good thing. I think going in completely blind to something as difficult and complicated and important as a divorce is kind of terrifying. So anything that reduces... But
that is the experience of most people, isn't it? You go into it totally blind and without any experience, or without any, the experience I guess many of us have is that we've known somebody who's divorced, and then we're suddenly thrown it into it ourselves. So I think it sounds like, getting that information into people's minds and having some public information about it would certainly help to keep things a lot more amicable.
Well, if you're on any journey, you need you want coordinates, don't you? I mean, and the divorce is a difficult journey, and the more you have in the way of coordinates and a route map, the less stress you will feel, I think. So I agree with you. I think, at the outset, I think any good lawyer or advisors like yourselves would be giving people a sense of the kind of route map, the journey, and giving them the security of knowing that, first of all, it's a journey with an end, and there are goals and all that sort of stuff. And all that sort of help is invaluable, really.
And what role do you think the media has to play in that sort of narrative around divorce? Because, I think we've come through quite a change in the last few years. I think the language around divorce in the media has been very conflict-based. It's been a lot about battles and entitlements and fights. And I think we're just starting to see a change in that language. What role do you think the media has to play in how normal people perceive divorce and how they approach divorce?
Well, I mean, I think that, depends which part of the media you're thinking about. But I mean, certain parts of the media love, the sort of big divorce stories, the big money divorces, the acrimonious divorces, the stars who get divorced, all that sort of stuff. What I think is really interesting about no-fault divorce, which I have to say I think is a very, very welcome change in our law, is that, it will reduce for so many people the pain, the acrimony. It just has always struck me as crazy, really, that when you are being torn apart as a couple and as a family, and sometimes it's absolutely nobody's fault. People fall out of love, things happen, at that point, to have to then sit down and work out, who's going to blame the other person, and to just put the sort of toxic element of blame into the whole process just struck me as always as being, just very undesirable. And I think it's a really positive move now that in England and Wales, there will be a system of no-fault divorce. And I think it will make it a lot easier for a lot of couples. Divorce is never going to be easy, but it will make it easier than, having to apportion blame. You were the unreasonable one. You acted unreasonably. In most divorces, both parties at various times have acted unreasonably, in my experience. And so, I think it's a very, very positive change in the law. I'm quite excited about it.
Yeah, me too, but not everybody's positive about it. There are still some factions, aren't there, that feel that it makes divorce too easy, that it, sticks the knife into marriage and all of those sorts of things. What do you say to that?
I just don't really agree. I just don't think any couple get divorced, for any reason other than there's a very, they're very unhappy together, And so, I don't think it's something people just, they get married thinking, we'll be able to get divorced easily. I just don't, no one thinks that way in my experience. I think there are some people who have religious, objections to the law change, and I can understand that perspective. I just think that, as I say, in my experience, most people, unless, it is slapping you in the face like a wet fish every day that you are very unhappy as a couple, you don't get divorced. And once you get to the position where you realize that really is the best option for moving on, as a couple, as, people, a family, then the easier you can make it in terms of separating and making sure you make the best possible arrangements and focus on all the right things, which is making the best living arrangements for your children, accommodation arrangements for yourselves, financial arrangements, so that people are because essentially you're halving your wealth when you get divorced in most cases. So it's a big deal, and creating the right environment and cooperation is absolutely critical in that process. And if you're having to sit down and blame each other, it just works against cooperating, I think, and doing the whole thing in a very civilized way.
To the no-fault divorce, will they make a big enough change, do you think, in terms of it's gonna stop the blame, so it's potentially going to help people start divorce off on the right foot? But then there are children issues and financial issues that aren't touched by these laws. So how do you think reform of those areas will come about, and what role do you think the media has to play in bringing about those changes?
Well, yeah, we mentioned the dreaded 4Me. I certainly think that the sort of financial ancillary relief regime could do with a good review and overhaul. As far as children arrangements concerned, I mean, we were very fortunate. I mean, we both agreed on co-parenting right from the get-go, and we've stuck to that. So I haven't been at the sharp end of difficulties in terms of contact and supervised contact, all that sort of stuff. But I know that there are many families that have really struggled with that, and the various organizations, Families Need Fathers and others that feel that there's need for serious need for reform in those areas.
And do you think the media can play a role in that, though? So what happens to get from an issue that just the professionals are talking about to something that actually, hits the public imagination and gets support? And then how does that turn into a bill and an act of parliament?
Yeah, I mean, the media, obviously, one of the jobs I felt I had at the BBC was to shine a light on, issues, malfunctioning of the justice system. So that once people become more aware of it, then the pressure for change and reform can grow. So, when lawyers were telling me things were going wrong, whether it's in the immigration system, the family system, or wherever, then, you were very keen to do stories on that, to bring it to mass attention. So in that sense, that's really what the media is there for. And so, of course, it has a role to play. And, politicians do listen to the media. And they take it pretty seriously. That's the way they communicate with the public. And I think the media often does a very good job in holding lawmakers to account and directing them in the direction of areas of the law that are not working or need review. So yeah, it's got that ongoing brief.
But if the media, and I'm using the broad brush term, the media, but if the media like the more sensationalist way things are reported, how do you get a good story without making it sensationalist? Because, two people coming together to do an amicable divorce isn't such a good scoop as, Fiona Shackleton getting a glass of water chucked over her head in a court. You can see the two extremes there. But how do we persuade the media to come with us on the journey for judicial reform and change in the family divorce laws?
Well, I mean, I think you're right that people like drama, and they like stories that are, sort of have an element of drama and confrontation to them, and you're never going to stop the media running those kind of stories. But so here's the thing that I always bear in mind in relation to any story. I kind of think almost anytime you open your mouth, you're telling a story. Certainly when you're broadcasting, you're telling a story. When you're in court, you're telling a story. So William Golding, who, the famous writer who wrote The Lord of the Flies, I remember him being interviewed and him saying that, if you have a screaming toddler who's sort of blue in the face, incandescent with rage, won't listen to reason at all, if you sit them on your knee and you say once upon a time, and you say it in the right way, you've got them. And I kind of think if you say once upon a time in the right way to any audience, you've got them. And, if you said in relation to a good news story, if you like, in inverted commas, or a story that isn't about conflict, it's up to the journalist and the media organization to work out a compelling way to tell those stories. I mean, not all of the stories I did as a journalist were about warring factions or, high profile people slugging it out in the courts by any means. And some of the best stories were, positive stories that, where things that were problems were, sort of sorted out, actually. And sometimes our coverage really helped with that. And so it's not just reserved for, the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard type cases. There are plenty of issues that people are genuinely interested in. And if you get the narrative right, you take them with you and they will understand it. And then they will, if they feel strongly about it, they'll want something done.
And I think you're right. It's the language that's so important, isn't it? When we started off by talking about language and the importance of language, and it's kind of, we're coming sort of almost full circle to it. It's the language that you use to speak about what's happening. And it can be colourful and it can be interesting without it being hateful or acrimonious or conflict-ridden. I think that's such an important change. And it goes across all of the different ways that even the government communicates as well. I mean, you look at the government website, gov.uk, which is the most trusted site that people go to when they're getting a divorce. And that's factually incorrect at the moment. It doesn't lay out in the correct language all of the different options people have for divorcing in an amicable way. It's still rooted in a traditional system of lawyers and everything else. And I think as now everybody can say anything, and we've got this proliferation of media and everybody's a broadcaster and we've got all these different channels, having certain sources where you've got really well crafted language that just sets the tone for how you want people to behave and to change. I think it's so incredibly important. I think the media or the professional media has such an important role in getting their language right and putting good content out. I really do.
Yeah, I mean, you think about this, certainly in my experience, you think about your language very, very carefully, a bit like lawyers do, actually. I mean, you weigh and measure your words. Doesn't mean you don't get it wrong at times, because of course you do. My best stories as a journalist always came from practitioners, people involved in a particular area of law. And I always knew they were a brilliant early warning system, because they knew of issues, malfunctions, problems, before they hit the mainstream media.
Yeah.
So I would make a point of going and visiting lots of firms of solicitors and barristers' chambers. And because I knew that if I could get that information first, then I can get it out into the mainstream media. So it's very important. I think the people at the coalface, as it were, practitioners and people involved, do alert journalists to, things that they feel are not working, not in the public interest, could be improved and should be improved. And then it's up to the journalist to find a way of getting that information out and telling those stories.
Well, I know you're heavily involved in getting the story out about no-fault divorce at the moment, so thank you for that. Where can people find out more about the law change, Clive?
Well, they can. I think Amicable has produced a very good guide to the new law. I mean, lots of obviously family law firms will have a guidance on their websites. As you say, there's a government website. There are all sorts of organizations, Resolution, which is a big organization of family lawyers. All of these are places where you can go and find out more about it. And of course, on April the 6th, there will be a lot of coverage. I mean, there are some obviously huge news stories at the moment, Ukraine, of course, being the biggest one. But this is a very important domestic story. It affects, more than 100,000 couples every year in England and Wales get divorced. So this is a very important story, and there will be a lot of coverage. I hope good coverage that provides very good information and explanations of how the system's changing.
Brilliant. And where can people find out more about you and what you're up to, Clive?
I talk to my mother. She knows everything.
You still hold your diary?
No, I mean, I don't actually have a website. So if I'm working on something like you mentioned the Duke, the film, then I tend to put out a tweet about it.
And what's your Twitter handle?
I'm at Coleman CR.
Okay, brilliant. And of course, you can find me on Twitter too. I'm at K_Daily. And you can hear about new podcast episodes by following at divorce_podcast. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you'd like to subscribe to more, then please visit thedivorcepodcast.com. Clive, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you all for listening.